Welcome everyone to our webinar on cover crops or resident vegetation. I'm Stetson Maldonado, the manager of the Seeds for Bees program, and I'm joined here today by Tom Johnson.
Good afternoon.
Here's a roadmap of our talk for today. So we're going to be discussing what are cover crops and resident vegetation, how are they similar, how do they differ, the pros and cons of each, and then we're going to discuss how they affect the farm and other population dynamics, such as turning cover crops into resident vegetation and using cover crops to change populations. So Tom's going to take it from the what are they to the cons of each, and then I will take over after that.
So cover crops, what they are intentionally planted non-economic crop for soil benefits. Generally, you select species that is going to be planted out there for a purpose, whether it's to improve the soil fertility, attract things, or what have you. So you get to choose what you're going to plant, and they'll be terminated basically on whatever your goals are for your crop or your soil program or whatever you're going to do. Resident vegetation are plants that grow in the wild, would normally naturally be there. They can be beneficial or they can be problematic, and they come from and they contribute back to the weed seed bank in the field. Both are alternatives to having bare soil, which is something that we really want to avoid for several reasons. Okay. So the similarities between a cover crop and resident vegetation, they both cover and protect the soil surface. They both do some soil health support by improving or maintaining the microbial activity that is in the field at the time. They will both support and shelter insects, beneficial and otherwise. They have potential to fix nitrogen, depending on what's growing out there. And they have the potential to improve your water infiltration through root action and slowing the water flow across the surface down by making it stand there longer. It comes more, percolates into the ground. Both cover crops and resident vegetation vary in their benefits based on the growing conditions, the population that's out there, and what you're using, or the species that's available. Okay. The differences. The difference between species, you have domestic plants versus wild plants. And that makes a difference in the life cycles that are out there. Some are warm season growing, some are cool season growing, some sprout in the spring, some sprout in the fall in the native vegetation. And then in the cover crop is generally planted in the fall to take advantage of our rainfall in California or wherever you're at. There's different management considerations. If you planted a cover crop, you have a plan in mind what you want to get out of it, how you're going to terminate that cover crop. If you are using native vegetation or resident vegetation, you're going to have other considerations. Do I want to try and limit seed production because I don't want that particular plant anymore, or am I good with it? How often am I going to have to mow it, or do I have to do something else to it? Achievable goals. You have a lot less control with the resident vegetation as to when it's going to show up, how well it's going to grow, what you're going to get out of it type of thing, than you would have over something that you intentionally placed there. Weediness. Resident vegetation is kind of by definition weeds. But on the other hand, planted cover crop can become kind of a weedy issue or act like a weed and do things you don't want it to do. And of course, there's the driver force on a lot of things is the cost. If you're going to plant a cover crop, you're going to basically have to plant it, buy it, and then do some more extra management potentially. Okay.
Yeah, and then before we go to the next slide, Tom, for those who wouldn't be aware, how would a domestic plant differ from a wild plant?
Domestic plants, such as what we would use in a cover crop stock, have been selected and or bred for uniform maturity and certain growth habits that they'll have out of them type of things. So if you, for instance, planted a fairly high level of small grains as a cover crop, it's almost all the plants are going to come up about the same time, get to about the same size, and be at the same growth stage maturity about the same time. With resident vegetation, a lot of times there will be plants that sprouted very early and went to seed early, and the same plant in the same field may come up over a much longer period and will have mature over a different amount of time. So there's a potential of it making seed whether you wanted it to or not, or growing back potentially more than a planted cover crop or domestic planted stuff would do. So that's kind of the big difference is you have a little more control over what you if you planted something with using domesticated materials versus what normally wants to grow out there.
And could you dive a little bit into how important the same maturation would be for termination?
Same maturation of the plants that you planted out there is going to have a lot to do with how successful you're going to be at any termination process that you want to do. Um, they're all about the same maturity. So when you go, if you mowed them, they're all going to be not necessarily in a position to regrow. If you were to roll them or crimper them, crimper treat them, or do something else type of thing out there, um, they're all going to react about the same. If you went out and did a multi-species resident vegetation um, biomass out there and tried to roll it, some of it's not even going to be affected, and some of it will be very affected by that treatment. The stuff that wasn't hardly affected has a bigger potential to regrow and continue being there and growing versus the stuff that really got mashed down or mowed off type of thing. And resident vegetation, a lot of times there's tall ones and short ones out there. So if you mow and cut most of it off, you know that you probably didn't cut all of it off versus something that's domesticated or very uniform in its growth pattern. When you mowed it, you know you got 98, 99% of it all affected the same way. So there's pros and cons, of course, to everything on this type of thing. So the pros of a cover crop is you can design what you're going to use to achieve a result that you need. You want better water infiltration, or you wanted better soil fertility type of thing. You could use singular plants or blends of plants that will promote that. We just discussed the easy termination at one plant stage. You planted it, it's all kind of about the same size, same period in its life. When you hit it with whatever you're going to hit it with, it's all going to react about the same type of thing. Planting a cover crop out there, you get a uniform distribution of plants. So if you put it in the tank, you know you're going to have about as many small grains at one end of the field as you do at the other. It's not going to be kind of a patch here and a patch there type of thing. And you've got some known genetics going for you. These things don't necessarily have pesticide or herbicide resistance built into them. They're going to react to whatever you do to them about the same type of thing versus patches of something out there that's been growing out there and you've been treating it for years, and that patch just keeps getting bigger and bigger, which indicates that you may be having a tolerance problem to your program and you're going to have to shift it or figure something out type of thing on that. And the thing with resident vegetation, at least starting out, it's self-planting. There's no effort involved in this. Of course, that makes it simple, easy. It's free seed. But what happens is the survivors kind of dictate what you're going to have out there. So a lot of times I've heard of people, where'd that weed come from? I've never seen it before. Well, that seed was there all along. It's just it happened to be a year that it's going to express. And if it wasn't in your deck of cards of what I got to control, it may turn into a bigger problem than you thought it was. This particular picture here is actually a very good example, and resident vegetation can work very well. This picture actually here is a very good example of resident vegetation acting as a cover crop. There's a diverse blend of materials in here. There's some mustard, there's cilantro, there's fillery, and there's a annual grass built into this thing. And basically all those plants came from a built-in seed bank prior to this orchard being installed. So they continue to carry on, they continue to show up. And you've got that diversity going on there. So yeah, you do get some diversity, but most of the time when I see resident vegetation, it's materials that you don't really want to deal with that are going to give you issues later on in harvest or harbor things that you don't necessarily want to harbor in that particular situation. Okay. And then, of course, there's the cons. In cover crops, it's another task, both getting it in and managing it later. So there's a cost of seed and the time and effort it takes to figure out what you're going to do and all that fun stuff. The cost of that extra operation of planting it, it's going to require time to do that. It also is going to require management on the back end as the plants are basically, when it's time to terminate it, no matter what, it's still another pass at least that you've got to do. It has a bit, pest potential. There's several different levels of that. Harborage of non-beneficial insects or virus vectors and or escapes, and then they become difficult to control of the cover crop plant. And it really boils down to if it fails or doesn't work, you've lost some of that money. You've had a loss of opportunity cost there. A con of resident vegetation is we don't have a whole lot of control over what's going to show up. So a lot of those plants can be pretty detrimental. They can be hard worked around to get harvest off of. They can also compete with moisture a lot more type of thing. A lot of times those detrimental ones are potential of creeping perennials. Bermuda grass comes to mind, creeping up on the berms and competing for water and under the vines or under the trees, getting into your micro irrigation systems and things like that. They can be difficult to manage between less herbicides available out there for that type of stuff, being able to reach under the vine with under vine or under tree cultivation equipment, if that was the way you have to do it. Basically, you don't know really, weeds are plant out of place. A lot of that resident vegetation out there is quick to set seed. They've selected themselves over millennia of I'm going to make seed, and their annual plants, and that's their whole mindset. So I'm going to make seed and drop it back out there. So you would have stuff that would sprout with the first rainfall, dropping seed about the time the next rainfall made the next one's coming up. So you're always adding to your seed bank on that type of thing. A lot of those annual grasses and quite a few of the annual weeds that we see in a lot of vineyards, orchards, and other crop areas are pretty shallow rooted. So you're putting the majority of the roots in the top 1 foot of the soil. They're going to intercept a lot of rainfall and not necessarily let much percolate past, but they're not necessarily adding a whole lot to your overall organic matter in that zone as well. Having it out there might not align with your farm goals. I want to do this, and I need to get this, and I need to get that out of my farm goals. And having those resident vegetation out there growing where you don't want it to, or trying to utilize it as your cover crop, and it spills seed everywhere, may turn into, we got to reevaluate what we're doing. And again, there's the pest potential. Some of these plants can be harbors for viruses. Some of them can be harbors for vectors. Some are also a little more attractive to things that you don't necessarily want out there, attracting insects in there or helping an insect population expand prior to when they can damage your cash crop. So you're going, okay, it's a fine balance. You're trying to go, okay, I want the soil coverage, but at the same time, if I'm using resident vegetation, I have just so little control over what actually is going to happen out there. Okay.
And then I was going to take over from here. So I'm going to be discussing farm goals. So the choice between using a cover crop or relying on vegetation largely depends on what your goal is and what your financial situation is like. So depending on your goals, either or can meet those needs. what I would highly suggest is first surveying what species are showing up and what do you want and which you don't want. This also really ties very well into IPM, weed IPM issues, because you really need to know what you're controlling before you try to control it. And you want to know what conditions you're going to need to change, such as using a cover crop to try to suppress a weed that you're struggling with, such as malva, also known as cheeseweed, or if you have a flea vein that's an issue, you don't want to be investing in that population in your soil bank, in your weed seed bank. If you're going to choose a cover crop, then you want to do it based on farm needs. So I have a few examples here. I have water infiltration, soil protection, nitrogen fixation, and weed suppression. So for example, a cover crop would do really well at suppressing your weeds or fixing nitrogen, depending on how it is designed, and also water infiltration as well, while resident vegetation will definitely help with protecting your soil and can affect water infiltration depending on what you already have showing up in your area. This is actually something I'm really excited about. It's a little bit more advanced, in my opinion, when it comes to cover crops, but the transition from cover crop into that becoming your resident vegetation, and I'll be discussing some farmers that have done that. And the process is by allowing your cover crop to reseed itself, it can lead to that cover crop species becoming your resident vegetation. Um, some species are better used for reseeding than others. So this one here is from a table grape vineyard. They had planted a cover crop of short-statured wildflowers, and here's a photo of some that have been reseeding themselves for the past couple of years. These are things such as calendula, sweet alyssum. They also have a lot of California poppy. Another farmer who I'm a big fan of, she plants a cover crop of brassicas. Actually, our pollinator brassica mix is what she plants. But previously, she had been using a annual clover mix as her cover crop, and she repeatedly allowed that to reseed itself. So now what her management goal is to plant that brassica cover crop. She'll roller crimp it to kill it, and then her resident clover population will grow up through that biomass and become basically a secondary cover crop that's fixing nitrogen, but she didn't have to plant it. She didn't have to do any effort for it. Um, the catch is what comes back is what survived the conditions and cultural practices on the farm. The main one here of the examples would be when you mow. So if you're going to let your cover crop reseed itself, you have to let it go through its life cycle, set seeds, turn brown, and basically die off and release that seed back into your soil. It's going to look ugly, it's going to be tough. And another issue is that when plants reseed themselves, typically they increase in their lignin content, which means that they're harder to mow. So for things that are smaller, like these calendula, like the clovers, them dying off and completing their life cycle isn't as much of an issue. I would not personally recommend doing this with the brassicas because it's going to be a lot harder to manage. And then not only are those stems going to be tougher, they're going to decompose slower because they'll have a greater carbon content. And lignin is carbon. It's makes those stems stiffer so they can hold the weight of the seed. Other things that will dictate this would be available moisture. So plants that survive best with the moisture that's showing up year over year will be the ones that thrive, while the ones that needed more water or potentially less water will be less likely to reseed and come back. And the final one I have listed here is weed competition. If you have weeds that outcompete the cover crop you're trying to get to reseed itself, then they aren't going to succeed. Clovers are notorious for not being able to compete very well with weeds. Tom, was there anything you wanted to add into this slide?
No, other than yeah, the weed competition and the mowing timing are kind of the two big tricks of the whole thing type of thing. And that what I call a biomass cover crop, which would be the brassica mix. Why you don't really want to make it reseed is you would have to let it stand until almost July sometimes for adequate seed production. And that's just way too late for most people. And not to mention it gets, several feet tall, if not taller. So it's going to be that. And another advantage of not letting some of those things go to that aren't necessarily meant to reseed is that as you go along, you're going to change, your program's going to change a little bit. And if you let that thing recede, you're going to have it for a long time. One example of this is when people would have a purple or hairy vetch in their mix and they would let it bloom and all that fun stuff. Well, one, that climbs trees, and two, they make what they call a hard seed. So out of 100 seeds that the plant would produce, 80, 90 of them would germinate the next year, but those other 10 may not germinate for 2 or 3 years. And all of a sudden they show back up again. And it's like, oh, where'd that come from? Oh, I remember I had that way back when. And no, I didn't like it then. And now I really don't like it. So it's you got to put a little thought process in the front end of that thing and think about what you want to get out of it, type of thing. But the mowing timing is probably the biggest issue on that and you could utilize mowing to reduce the weed competition, which would make the clover work better. Another one is what they found once upon a time was you could leave 1/3 of the stand standing and dry out and make seed, and you would have enough seed for next year to do the whole width over again. It would reseed itself back over again. You didn't have to mow all of it, and you didn't have to leave all of it standing. You could mow just a little bit and leave some out there, and it would manage to reseed enough, because one plant turns into anywhere from 5 seeds to several hundred seeds. So you're expanding how much seed's going to be available out there.
When you say leaving 1/3, are you meaning like a little bit of a strip along the side of the drive row?
Yeah, exactly. If you had a 8-foot mower and a 12-foot planted zone, you could do one pass with the 8-foot mower and leave that 4-foot standing over there, and it would make more than enough seed for the 12 feet again next year.
And then this slide is changing dynamics. So I'm going to be discussing both population dynamics and soil conditions. So cover crops can be selected to suppress undesirable species. My favorite example of this would be using brassicas to suppress malva, because I have a personal beef with malva. You could be aiming for a different weed that could be an issue in your particular location, such as Italian ryegrass and others. And changing soil conditions can alter which species thrive and which don't. So if you have a soil that's really compacted, that doesn't have a lot of organic matter, you're going to have scrappier plants that show up and thrive, such as hairy fleabane. As that soil becomes less compact and healthier, you can have other plants showing up. So in a vegetable row crop that I would manage, I went from a lot of malva to more of a lamb's quarter condition when it came to changing that population with the soil. I would still get some malva, but I'm getting more of a different species. So cover crops can change the population of your resident vegetation. And then cover crops will also change the soil, but this is a multi-year benefit or a multi-year phenomenon. This isn't going to be something that happened in your first year and then boom, it's like all different. So you can get even greater cover crop growth over time. So year over year over year, your cover crop can slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger, assuming your growing conditions are staying roughly the same and you're getting your rainfall and whatnot. You can also get more seed germinating. So in healthier soil conditions, you can get more seed that comes up. That would be both for your cover crop and for your resident vegetation. And that could be a good thing. That could be a bad thing as far as resident vegetation goes. As when it comes to cover crops, you paid for that seed, so you want it to grow. But my favorite is faster decomposition. You're investing in that soil population, you have more decomposers. So a lot of that biomass will get decomposed a lot faster than compared to how it used to be in soils that are more dead. But I would suggest you really want to watch your populations, especially in your resident vegetation, year over year over year, and you'll start seeing some differences. And then this is our closing slide. I would really want to say thank you to our donors. Our donors are the people who make this program possible. They're the ones that are providing the fundings for all of this free seed. And we are entirely funded by private donations from individuals and corporations, which means that this program can be stacked with any federal or state grant. It's not going to interfere with those opportunities. And I really want to thank everybody who's helped participate in keeping this program alive. We are well over a decade now since we were first founded, and I really want to extend my appreciation to everybody who's made that possible. And I want to thank you for watching this webinar.
Thank you for attending.
There we go.